Warm greetings to everyone. I am Jeet Hazarika. I'm from the Tetso College, Nagaland. And on behalf of the Society of International Affairs, Tetso, and the Institute for World Affairs and Security, I welcome all of you to this web talk. We have amongst us today's speaker, Professor Salvatore Babones, who shall be speaking on the topic, the new economic geography, global production networks in the post-GFC, post-coronavirus world. We have this chairperson for the talk also, Professor Utpal Kumar De, and I shall introduce them properly in a bit. We also have amongst us Jyoti Pradhan from the Institute of World Affairs and Security. And we are also joined by faculty members, students, and other members of the Tetso College and beyond. And all of them I welcome, and I'm glad you could find this time to be here with us today. So I will not take too much time. I shall quickly highlight the structure of today's program before I go into the introduction. So we shall start with a brief introduction of the speakers, the speaker and the chairperson, and I shall do that part. After this, we will have an opening note by the chairperson, then the main highlight, that is the speaker's presentation, followed by the chairperson's comments, if any. And after this, the chair can open the discussion for questions from the participants. And lastly, a thanking note from my side. That is the brief structure of the program. Now, let's go to the introductions. First of all, we have Salvatore Babones, who is an American sociologist. He's an associate professor at the University of Sydney and an expert in areas of Chinese and American economy and society. His research is related to macro-level structures of the world economy, with a particular focus on China's global economic integration. He's an author of several books, numerous academic articles, and he's also a regular contributor to several media platforms such as Foreign Affairs, Al Jazeera, The Australian, and such. Briefly about his academic background, Professor Babones received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 2003, and he was the professor of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. And in 2008, he joined the University of Sydney. He has also been a visiting associate professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and a visiting scholar at Academia Sinica in Taipei. Professor Babones' work is vast, and I would just like to highlight a bit on that. His reformulation of the world systems analysis and more specifically the introduction of the strong theorem into this perspective is a distinguished contribution in explaining the core periphery hierarchy of the world, of the modern world economy. Equally remarkable is his use of the historical Chinese concept of Tianjia, all under heaven, to describe the structure of the millennial world system as an American Tianjia that has endogenized the world, the entire world economy under a single American-dominated political system. He has been associated with various institutes, policy level, and other think tanks, including the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, the Russian International Affairs Council, Center for International Relations, Poland Asia Research Center, and such. His work, his recent work, a book published in 2018, The New Authoritarianism, Trump, Populism, and the Tyranny of the Experts, on Donald Trump and his administration, which deals with modern meaning and framing of concepts such as democracy, populism, and authoritarianism. This book was received as the best on politics 2018 by the Wall Street Journal. And his upcoming book, that is on liberal authoritarianism in practice, is due for release in late 2023. And he also writes on other areas of research, particularly quantitative methodology. And I will not go into the details of his work. It'll take us quite a while to include all of the details. So I will just conclude my introduction for Professor Babones here. And Professor Babones, I welcome you for this talk. And we are pleased to welcome you. And we are glad you could join us today. Let me also introduce the chairperson of this talk. Utpal Kumar De is currently Professor of Economics at the Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, in Meghalaya, state of India. Professor De has been engaged in teaching at postgraduate level since 1994. His areas of interest include agricultural and development economics. It also encompasses environment, natural resources, concerns regarding climate change, as well as empowerment of women. He is an author of 9 volumes and numerous academic articles. He has completed half a dozen research projects and has delivered numerous lectures in national and international platforms. He also holds editorial positions in different journals. Professor De has been a visiting scientist and guest faculty at the Indian Statistical Institute, ISI. Apart from teaching positions, he has held several positions in administrative bodies. Regarding his work, recently Professor De has co-edited a compendium titled The State of Economic Development in South Asia. He has previously authored and co-edited books on development and deprivation in Indian subcontinent. He has also published on inequality and poverty and development in India, focusing on the Northeastern region. So I thank you, Professor De, for joining us today. And with this, I hand over to Professor De. You may begin. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Ajit, and present dignitaries today. We are very glad and fortunate to have with us Professor Salvatore Babones. Though I did not have much introduction with him earlier, but going through his biodata and the work, I see that it is totally different from my field of work anyway. So it will not be possible for me to give that in-depth discussion about the work that he goes through. But definitely, if we go by the best superstructure controversy of the Marx and others that Wittfogel are there's a political philosophy. There from there we can see that this macroeconomic or political that authoritarian whatever you are writing on that, or the system of the liberalism. So these are closely, we can say that these are partly superstructural things and very closely knit with the production base, definitely. So unless you have the good atmosphere, so resource allocation and its utilization will not be possible to achieve the best welfare in the society. So definitely your work is related with many of the things, but in depth. As your today's topic, that is new economic geography and global production network in the post-global, I think GFC means global financial crisis you want to mean, and the post-coronavirus world. So both these two are great, left a great mark on the human society and the activity patterns. It changed, especially of the coronavirus. Everything gone on online mode, and in the online mode, so those who can, just now I gave in the keynote address also, that those who can adapt better to the new innovative technology to go in the online mode, even from the production and the distribution system. In your marketing also now in online, even your food and vegetables are reaching at home. You can order online and everything supplied, and third parties enter. The production is one and consumption is at another place, and the linking is by some other intervening companies came, whose supply is whose task is to collect from the restaurants and supply in the household. So even if you do not at home any person, so and the food baskets also coming without the manpower or effort of the restaurants also. So another company came for that supply. Similarly, for the Amazon and all other companies came. They are basically the interlinking in the market system came. So the post-pandemic situation of the coronavirus, so this that world has become more close now. Even the material from America in no time, within a week, is reaching, where people are getting access earlier, even 10 years before, which we could not think of. 10 years before, we could not think that without having physical access and get a knowledge. So quickly through internet, in 1 minute, you can place an order and make payment, and material will come within 3-4 days. So geographically become more close-knit, the society. Of course, it is not hassle-free. Simultaneously, more hassles are coming on that way. So when you go, you are ordering some material, something else are being delivered. So, but apart from that, it has a great benefit also. So this pandemic has given us a good knowledge that how to adapt. Until and unless you can adapt with the new situations, you have to perish. And that imbalances in the geographical distribution also we can see more close, but at the same time more imbalances also. The areas or people who can adapt better, so they are achieving their greater goal. Similarly, on the financial crisis after that, how gradually they cope up. I think I will not take much time from him rather. So we are all of us are eager to hear Professor Babun, since he is the master in that line. So I hand over the floor to him and request him to deliver his speech. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you.
Please.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Jeet, for that over introduction. Professor Day, I hope you don't mind if I let all the students and the junior people in on a secret, which is that if you have a career of 30 years, even if you only do one thing every year, then they can list all these 30 things you did. So although it may sound like a lot, in fact, one thing a year isn't very much to do. So I'm really glad that I have the opportunity to talk to you about some of my research. And let me, I don't use Google Meet very often, so let me think, yes, I think I can share.
Slides. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep, I'm doing my best here. I want to.
May I come in? This is
allow.
Jyoti.
Yes, Jyoti, you can help, please.
Yes.
Yes, Professor. Yeah, Professor. Yes, Professor, you got it.
I'm sharing screen now, right?
Yes, Professor, it's visible to us.
Yes, we're good. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking today about the new economic geography and really what globalization means in the new economic geography. Let me start off with just a simple chart. This is a chart of our typical measures of globalization. The traditional historical measures, when I started out as a graduate student in the 1990s, what we used to measure globalization. In the 1990s, we were all talking about trade. And that's this blue line. Trade as a percent of global GDP. It was at a relatively low level. Now, the earliest data we have reliably are for around 1970. Before 1970, the data are really not very useful because a lot of the imperial data before decolonization clouded things. Was trade between Algeria and France international trade or domestic trade? This was not clear. By 1970, almost all countries had become independent. Certainly all major countries had become independent. We can start measuring international trade, and that became the standard indicator of globalization. And as you can see, with a few hiccups, it went up, 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 until reaching a maximum in 2008. After the global financial crisis, trade as a percent of global GDP declined. Now, it declined dramatically during the crisis. It bounced back, but it has never reached its former level. That is, the all-time high of world trade as a percentage of GDP has remained stuck at 60%. And that's that. So by one conventional measure, globalization stopped. Well, now that's now 14 years ago, right? And if we look at investment, foreign direct investment as an alternative measure, it's the same story. 2007 was the peak of foreign direct investment and then declined. And so if you stick with conventional measures, globalization has been over for more than a decade now. And that's why many container ship lines had bankruptcies or had a lot of severe trouble in the 2010s. Not because of COVID. Even before COVID, they had trouble because they had bought supermassive container ships, 10,000, 12,000, up to 15,000 containers on a ship. And they expected that trade would just keep increasing forever. And then what happened? Well, trade flatlined, and they had to take delivery of all this extra capacity that they couldn't use. All right. But let's take a look at the structure of that new globalized economy. I mean, I prefer to think that globalization may have ended, but it was not really a, well, it was really a step change. We went from a non-global world in the 1970s. I mean, most students won't remember this. I don't remember it. But if you wanted to go abroad in the 1970s, you had to bring cash, and you had to get a license to bring it in many countries. My very first trip in the 1980s, I had to bring traveler's checks that I had to purchase in America, bring them to England. I went to London. There were no ATM machines that I could use overseas, nothing like that. I literally had to bring traveler's checks, and I had to declare, you have to declare them. Many of you have gone through airports, and you've seen that, please declare if you're carrying currency more than $10,000. And you think, who except for a drug trafficker carries currency of more than $10,000? That's crazy. Well, in fact, people used to, because if you were taking a 2-month trip and you had to pay for all of your hotels in cash for a family, yeah, you might need more than $10,000 in cash in your suitcase. Okay, now we live in a globalized world. The globalized economy, depending how you count, is between $75 and $80 trillion for the world economy, GDP, total GDP for the world. A little less than 1/3 of that, 29%, is in North America. About 1/4 of it is in Europe, in European Union and the other states of Western Europe, but Europe not including Russia. And about 23% is in East Asia. That's China, Korea, Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, the East Asian region. The amazing thing is the rest of the world, leaving aside these 3 very well integrated economic zones, rest of the world is less than 1/4 of GDP. That is, all of South America, Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, all the global South taken together, less than 1/4 of global GDP. Really, the world economy is in these 3 major regions. But it's not just that that's where it is. These 3 regions are highly integrated. So for North America, roughly 50% of all trade among North American countries, that is Canada, US, and Mexico, 50% of their trade is with other countries in North America. Now that's remarkable when you consider that trade between California and New York does not count as international trade. That's all within one country. So when we think of the North America being, very globalized, tied to the rest of the world, in fact, half of the total trade happening for these 3 countries is actually among just these 3 countries. What's more, 87% of that zone by GDP is fully integrated under one set of governance rules. Now, there are minor changes by US states, sales taxes differ, but fundamentally, the US is a single integrated economic zone. So what we have is this one zone, which is roughly 30% of the global economy. It's closely integrated within the zone, and there's full integration at the heart of the zone. The US economy is a single anchor economy at the heart of the zone. If we move over to Europe, intra-European trade is around 69% of European trade. But remember, trade between Paris and Berlin is quote unquote international, while trade between New York and Los Angeles is not. So that Europe has higher levels of within the region trade doesn't really say a lot. In fact, if a single zone at the center of Europe were taken, like if the European Union were taken as a single zone, like the US is a single zone, we would see this figure come down dramatically. It would be much under 50, far, far below 50%. Okay. What's more, the political integration at the center of the zone. So the European Union is 94% of the European economy, pre-Brexit. These are pre-Brexit figures. Well, the European Union is not really an integrated economic zone in the sense that the US is. It has the ambition to be one, but national regulations differ far greater within Europe than do state regulations in the US. Now, post-Brexit, only 78% of the European Economic Zone is integrated within one area within the European Union. So the European Union is, or Europe is, a smaller economic zone, is a less integrated economic zone, and has a less political integration than North America. When we go over to East Asia is again a smaller zone. Again, although 52% of Asian trade is with other Asian countries, that's not really comparable to North America, since North America is just 3 countries. East Asia includes China, Japan, Korea, North Korea for what it matters, Taiwan as a separate economic entity, the Philippines, Vietnam. So probably less than 50% is truly intra-regional if we were to compare apples to apples with the US. But much more importantly, much less of the zone is fully integrated. That is, 2/3 of the East Asian zone is accounted for by China. And China's level of political governance is, of course, extremely low. So whereas, again, in North America, you have one economy, one set of regulations at the center of the largest economic zone that's very well integrated. In East Asia, you have terrible economic governance, China, at the center of a zone in which it's not really as dominant in the zone, and in which intra-regional trade really is not quite as well established. Okay. When we look at things that way, what we really see is a world that has North America as by far the leading or the most integrated economic zone in the world. On top of that, North America is reasonably closely connected to Europe. Just using a container ship sailing time, it's 10 days travel from North America to Europe by container ship. North America to East Asia, I've used Yokohama here as a benchmark, is 15 days. If you want to use Shanghai as a benchmark, it becomes 18 days, something like that. Still, not that far. However, you'd think that with all these maps of Belt and Road, China connected to Europe, all of this, you'd think China is really connecting to Europe. Well, it's about 30 days. So from East Asia to Europe by ship via the Suez Canal, is 30 days. If you have to go around Africa, so if you're talking a big container ship, then it's even more. It might be 45 days, something like that. Now, it is possible via the Belt and Road Initiative, Eurasian Rail, to bring that down to 15 days by rail. But the capacity of rail is much smaller than the capacity of seaborne travel. In fact, the entire rail traffic between China and Europe is less than a single day's exports from Shanghai port, largest port in China and in the world. So although it is possible to get faster from China to Europe, the volume is very small. Okay, what all this means is that although we tend to see the world with this map with Europe and Africa at the center, from an economic geography standpoint, it's really North America at the center, with Europe in the east and Asia in the west. Now, we're all very Eurocentric in our thinking. We tend to think, oh, Asia's in the east. No. From an economic geography standpoint, Asia's in the west. It's the far west of America. It is not the far east of Europe. Okay. I want to, I'm American. Some people think, oh, I'm just some kind of a patriotic American trying to rah-rah USA. Look, I'm just trying to present the facts. And I think these are facts that most people are just unaware of. So, for example, we tend to think that the US and Europe, oh, yeah, they're both rich areas. Germany, America, they're both rich countries. In fact, Germany has the GDP per capita of the US state of Mississippi. Now, if you've ever heard of Mississippi, you've probably heard of Mississippi as being, I'm sorry, Alabama. Germany's same as Alabama. If you've ever heard of Alabama, you probably think of Alabama as being, a poor, backwards U.S. state where everybody has a pickup truck and a gun, loves football, and votes for Donald Trump. And you wouldn't be too wrong when you said that, but it's one of the poorer places in the United States. In fact, GDP in North America is roughly 1/3 higher than GDP in Western Europe. And GDP in the northeastern United States, so in the leading area of the United States, the Northeast running from Washington, D.C. to Boston, that Northeast corridor of states from, let's say, from Virginia to Maine, that area is 50% richer than Germany. Just to put it in comparison. Now, Japan, we think of Japan, bullet trains, high technology. Japan's even poorer. Japan is on a par with Mississippi, the poorest state in the US in GDP per capita. Now, that may be shocking, right? I mean, that California is literally twice as rich as Japan, because we hear news from California. We hear, oh, California has drought. It has problems with gun violence, problems with illegal immigration, marijuana, all these problems coming out of California, whereas Japan is a well-ordered society with, bullet trains that run exactly on time, super modern nuclear power, all incredible robots. Well, statistically, California per capita is literally twice as rich as Japan. And Japan, of course, is the richest country in Asia. We don't usually think of the world that way, but that's the statistical reality of the world. And in fact, manufacturing in the United States, many Americans, including people like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, are constantly complaining, why has manufacturing left the United States? We need to bring manufacturing back. Well, in fact, the major manufacturing centers in the United States now, the places where car companies, automobile companies are now doing automobile assembly in the US, are in the deep southern states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. In other words, those states that are as poor as Japan and Germany are now the leading manufacturing centers of the United States. The rest of the United States is simply too rich for manufacturing. It's moved on to a postmodern services economy. Okay. There are other ways in which the world economy really is centered on the US. So if we look at, for example, the stock distribution of value in stock markets around the country, you can see that the US stock markets, primarily the New York markets, New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, are overwhelmingly larger in market capitalization than other equity markets in the world. And if I were to change this chart from market capitalization to trading volume, you wouldn't even be able to fit it on a chart, because trading volume in US markets are incredibly more liquid than other markets around the world. Now, I show this chart, again, not to say how great the US is, but to emphasize just how extreme the differences are. I mean, you might think that Frankfurt, okay, it's not quite up there with New York as a financial center. Or you might think that Tokyo, well, it just has some way to go. No, the Gulf is enormous. I mean, there's just no comparison between New York as a financial center and any other place in the world. Okay. But this dominance that has long been established for the 20th century economy, the economy of manufacturing and stock exchanges and container ships, the economy of the globalization era in which the world was rapidly globalizing, well, that dominance has now transferred over from the tangible economy of manufacturing and trade to the intangible economy of online services. Okay. Now, obviously, when we think of the mobile phone era, we think of Apple, but Oppo is just like 6 months behind Apple in hardware. In many cases, the leading Chinese companies, especially before the US chip bans, were slightly ahead of Apple in terms of their actual specs. If you were to look at the specs of the phones, the first quad camera phones were introduced by Huawei, not by Apple. So they were actually ahead on the specs. But it's not that drives the value. Of course, the value is not in manufacturing phones. The value is in the apps. And almost all of those apps are either American, so Google, Facebook, et cetera, or they're Chinese. The Chinese apps have been able to succeed only in China. They've had marginal success outside China, with one exception of TikTok. TikTok has now become a big global success, but they've had marginal success outside China. They really rely on a protected Chinese market and have not done anything or much of anything outside of that. If you want to look for a European app, I always ask people, what is the largest and most important online app you can think of that comes from Europe? And you have to go way down the list. Most people can't even name one, or they're unaware that they're European. As far as I know, the top European app in terms of user base is Spotify. You have to go that far down. Get away from the big giants of the internet world. Spotify is the best app the most used app that's come out of Europe. Okay. What is this doing? This is really changing the economy. I mean, we have the 20th century economy where we built things and traded them. So we had a bicycle that got traded across borders. Someone bought the bicycle somewhere other than where it was made. But the value today is not in the bicycle. The value today is in the bicycle rental. Now, that was pioneered in China. But in fact, if you go to most cities around the world, increasingly you see US-dominated apps that are offering the bicycle rentals. That is, although China had the idea, the entrepreneurship, Chinese companies are not succeeding around the world in this, in whether it's the bicycles or the Ubers of the world. So Didi is not really competing well with Uber, except in some very poor countries where Didi massively subsidizes its service in order to compete with Uber. These apps where what you're paying for is the rental or the service instead of actually buying something. The new generation of internet apps, again, have been overwhelmingly American. Now, I see this as a shift from the world of hardware. And I don't just mean computer hardware. I mean physical things. You know, the world where we bought physical things, the world of hardware, where globalization led to the production being moved offshore from places like the US and Europe to low-cost places, ultimately centering low-cost manufacturing in China. Now some of that is being priced out of China, and low-cost manufacturing is going especially to Bangladesh, a little bit to East Africa. Vietnam has become a big center of low-cost manufacturing. But that world of hardware, where we traded things across countries, went through a phase where software was more important. So not the hardware itself, but in the literal computer sense, the software that ran on it. So Microsoft becoming a more valuable company than IBM. But I could also think of software more broadly. So what is the value in a sofa? Most of the value in a sofa is not the physical thing you sit on, it's the design. What's the value in a phone? It's not the physical brick that you buy. It is the design, the user experience. That's why people pay so much more for an Apple phone. They're not paying for the device. They're paying for the Apple experience. So that's the software. But what we really see emerging out of that is that the important thing isn't even the software. It's what I like to call the netware. That is, it is, well, I'll put it down here, a definition, the production system that generates value from the interconnectedness of people and or things. The company that owns the graph connecting people. So a great example is Uber, Uber Eats, DoorDash, I don't know what's popular in India. These apps that connect people to delivery, to local delivery services, right? So restaurants send takeout via the app to you, or you use it for mobility, use the app. These netware apps are generally not very sophisticated pieces of software. I mean, if you were to open up your phone and look at the number of megabytes that Uber takes up on your phone, it's tiny. It's not a really important piece of software. It's almost as nothing compared to, say, Microsoft Office. That's a massive, complex piece of software. Well, the value of Uber isn't really in the software. It's not the proprietary software. It is in the network of people who use it. So it's the netware, the social graph that makes the company valuable, not the code that has been written to run it. All right. So when we go back to this picture of the global economy, North America then becomes even more the center of the world economy because it's the center of the internet. As I joked when we were starting, I'm talking to you not across the Indian Ocean. I'm talking to you across the Pacific, through the US, across the Atlantic, through Eurasia and to India, because that's where the capacity is on the internet, but also because that's where the networks are centered. For example, we're using Google Meet. Well, even if we could get a direct internet cable, I mean, who knows? We'd have to do a trace to find out how we're actually connecting. But because we're using Google Meet, almost certainly codes and keys have to be sent from the US to enable this meeting, even if the physical traffic is not occurring on a trans-Pacific cable, even if the physical traffic is going through a trans-Indian cable, the codes, the keys, the organization enabling the network is based in the United States. Okay. And what that represents is a change in the way value chains are governed. Now, this is work from Gary Dreffy. This is classic sociology of management. Gary Dreffy's a sociologist at, I think he's at Duke. Yeah, he's at Duke University. Now, I'm going to read this chart from right to left instead of from left to right. I didn't create this chart. Dreffy created this chart, and you'll find it in all of his work. We've moved from a 20th century world of hierarchical firms. The classic 20th century firm was an integrated hierarchical firm. Ford Motor Company made everything. It owned the entire value chain, and ultimately it sold you the car in a Ford dealership. Then that moved to captive value networks where, well, Ford might still make the car, but it had a tire supplier, a steering column supplier, and a brake supplier that only supplied Ford. So Ford had a lot of control. It was at the center of this network. Okay. That moved towards relational value chains where a lead firm, again, Ford has the branding on the firm, but it worked with a bunch of suppliers. Those suppliers didn't only necessarily work for Ford, but they had long-term relationships with Ford. They made things specifically for the Ford car. So Ford's designing a car. It needs a steering column for the new Ford Mustang. It has to have these, it has to have meet certain requirements, and the relational supplier would work with Ford to supply it. And actually, this is still the way the defense industry tends to work. So when India developed the Tejas fighter, that's Hindustan Aeronautics creating the fighter plane, but it has a relationship with General Electric for the engines, and it gives the specifications. General Electric works with General Electric to get exactly the engine it needs. General Electric supplying the engines and contracting out to all sorts of other components and stuff. Okay. Then we have a modular chain, which is kind of what the internet has enabled us moving towards, which is the lead firm. So if you buy earbuds, for example, it doesn't matter if you're buying Samsung earbuds, Sony earbuds. There's just a company in China that makes earbuds, and they go every year to a conference, and Sony or Apple or Samsung says, we want earbuds, to meet these specifications, and the quote-unquote turnkey supplier simply supplies earbuds to those specs. And there might be 10 suppliers of the same earbuds that you're buying from Sony. You'll never know who manufactured them. The branding is Sony, but there's a supplier in China that's actually making them. And the supplier in China may come to Sony with a fully manufactured earbud and say, Sony, would you like these? Brand them as Sony. We'll sell them to you at a certain price. Okay. All along this continuum, according to Dreffy, this moves from a very high level of control to a very low level of control by the lead firm until you finally get to just a market mechanism where, suppliers and customers meet in an online marketplace, and in that idealized online marketplace, all the like Etsy, for example, if any of you know Etsy, which is an online peer-to-peer craft marketplace. Producers just produce what they want and put it on Etsy. We consumers go to Etsy and buy them. We never have to meet each other. We meet in the middle, and there's a price-setting mechanism in the marketplace. And Dreffy thought that this went from the highest degree of coordination and power and control to the lowest degree. What Dreffy didn't anticipate in 2005 when he published this was the evolution of the internet. Because in fact, internet marketplaces have developed in such a way that the higher level of control is now in the market mechanism, not in the hierarchical mechanism. So if we imagine Uber, and Uber is a marketplace, drivers for Uber and riders, customers, simply use Uber as a marketplace to negotiate a price. That sounds like, power is decentralized. In fact, Uber is able to take 40%, 40% of the cost of your ride. Depends on the country, but in Australia, it's 40% of the cost of that matching is going to Uber. Now, Uber is doing nothing. I mean, the driver is providing the car, providing the insurance, the driver is providing everything. The customer is doing all the paying. All Uber does is match up drivers with customers with a very light app. I mean, again, the Uber app did not take billions of dollars to develop. The billions of dollars in Uber have been spent on acquiring the network. Creating the customer network. It's not on the app itself. The app is really nowhere near as sophisticated as a major piece of software like SAP or Microsoft software. The app is a light app. Okay, so we've actually seen that the internet has enabled whoever is at the center of this marketplace to capture an inordinate amount of the value. And in fact, all the knowledge is here in the marketplace, because only the marketplace knows the customer and knows the seller. Sellers don't know the customers don't know the sellers. Only the marketplace, the Uber, the Google, the YouTube, Facebook, only they know both of us. And thus, Uber is able to take 40%. On YouTube, if you support a creator on YouTube, 30% of the total amount. Now, you're just making a donation, right? I mean, you're a member of a YouTube channel. All Google is doing for its 30% is processing the donation. 30%, not a 2% transaction fee, 30%. Why? Because it's sitting at the center of the social graph connecting the two. Okay. These newly emerging netware business models are modular, they're market-oriented, but they're not uncoordinated. So in Jeffrey's view of how we would, how supply chains would look, or how supply chains did look pre, well, Internet 1.0, pre-iPhone, his idea of how supply chains looked was the more decentralized, he thought lower coordination, less asymmetry. No. In fact, the more decentralized the network, the higher degree of coordination by whoever is controlling the social graph, the higher the power asymmetry between whoever controls the social graph, the Amazon, the Google, the Uber, and the participants in the network. Okay, that lead firm is the one who owns the social graph. The lead firm is not the supplier. So when I'm renting an Uber, the lead firm here is not the poor driver who's getting $10 for driving me somewhere, what we would think of as the seller in the marketplace. No, it's the coordinator of the market who's the lead firm. The lead firm is whoever owns the social graph. And in fact, the oversight doesn't even have to be provided by that lead firm. They don't even have to spend money on oversight. The customer provides the oversight. 5-star reviews, okay, the driver must be doing fine. 2-star reviews, there's a problem. And that applies not just to Uber, that applies to Facebook, YouTube, using customer feedback in order to monitor the salespeople on their network. Amazon does the same. I mean, how does Amazon know if a seller on the Amazon marketplace is actually delivering the goods they say they are? They know because if they don't, I'll complain to Amazon. As long as I don't complain, they assume that, so I'm the one doing the monitoring. Amazon doesn't even have to spend the money to make sure that the product I bought on their platform was actually sent to me. Okay. Now, the problem with measuring this is that the global data infrastructure is not set up to capture this. The global data infrastructure is set up to measure when goods move across borders at ports and they go through customs. Well, much of this isn't happening. I mean, when you book an Uber in India, well, 40% of that may be going to California, but it's not appearing in any international trade statistics. It doesn't appear in India's international trade. Now, it will appear in balance of payments in a very indirect way, but it's not part of the trade statistics for India. In fact, it may not even be going to the US. So, when you buy something on the Apple App Store, it's appearing as part of Ireland's GDP, which is why Ireland, by the way, now has to publish 2 sets of GDP statistics. It publishes the actual in Ireland GDP per capita and GDP statistics, and then it publishes an Ireland, it publishes an Ireland nominal GDP, which includes all of the value that's nominally booked in Ireland by international companies that are based in Ireland because it's a low-tax jurisdiction. And then it publishes a separate alternative series that is Ireland's real GDP, which cuts out all of that money that never actually comes to Irish people. It's just legally money that is legally resident in Ireland because it was charged through Apple or Google or something like that. Okay. If it's not Apple and it's just it's not something like a direct fee to Apple, but it's something like Google making money off of selling ads. Well, that may, Google's ad revenue may you're in India, but you may be looking at a website in the US and the ad is appearing on the US website. It's not even clear where that revenue is being booked, right? Actually, it's probably being booked in the country of the advertiser, whoever's paying the fee for it. So again, it's very unclear where this is appearing in our statistics. Okay. Now, as the Internet of Things expands, and this isn't just intangible services, but it's actually a thing that is running on the internet by electricity meter, it'll become even harder to understand how the global economy is operating. The international data infrastructure simply isn't equipped to measure the global economy. Okay, one thing is clear, however, the emerging netware economy is primarily a Pacific economy. That is, the 20th century world, mass production, that was an Atlantic world. There was relatively little trade across the Pacific before 1950, and even in the late 20th century, the Atlantic dominated world trade. But the postmodern world economy of network connectivity is very much centered in the Pacific. It is overwhelmingly dominated by American and Chinese companies. But I've increasingly come to believe that it is likely to become Indo-Pacific. And of course, we want to keep our eyes on Bangalore, on Hyderabad, on Delhi, on the big centers of app development in India. Now, I have to admit that before about 2018, I didn't really have my eye on India because I thought that the tangible production networks that were centered on the Pacific, what we call the flying geese pattern of development. Production went from the US, was sent overseas to Taiwan, and then from Taiwan, it was sent overseas to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong, it was sent inland to Guangdong, and then from Guangdong, it was sent further inland to Sichuan. I thought those networks fundamentally were never going to benefit India because India was in the wrong ocean. I've since come to realize that the real value in the world today is not being produced in these factories in Guangdong and Sichuan. The real value is coming from the value of the networks and the development of networks. China is not and never will be an offshore center of software development or of the netware economy. However, because India not only has the technical skills, not only is becoming a center for the online economy, but because India has, well, either the largest or second largest domestic market of internet users, depending how you count. In any case, 1.4 billion people who can potentially be online in India. India will increasingly be a place where apps are not only developed, but tested. Because the one thing you need for an online app is to have a large group of users, a large user base on which to develop your algorithms. Now, those of you who study artificial intelligence and machine learning, you'll realize that machine learning depends on volume. You have to have a lot of users in order to train your algorithm. And India has, in this sense, a natural advantage. I mean, one reason why so many apps come out of the US is that if you develop an app in the US, you can make it work extremely well in the US based on the very large domestic user base before you try to send it elsewhere. That same economy of scale for netware apps also theoretically applies to India. And so I wouldn't be surprised if in the 2020s, we increasingly see world-beating netware apps emerging out of India, not just because India is an online economy, a growing country, et cetera, but because India will have better training for its machine learning. Now, India's machines will learn better than, say, Australian machines or European machines. Now, that's just a guess. I'm a sociologist. I'm not a computer scientist. I'll just let the computer scientists think about that. In any case, what I am sure is that China's growth is over. China stopped growing, I believe, in 2017. Now, there's still a lot of debate about this. China reported high levels of growth for the last 5 years. But starting in 2017, I started looking at China and saying, look, 2017, 2018, auto sales were down, mobile phone sales were down, real estate prices were down, stock market was down. This is not an economy growing at 7 or 8% per year. And you in India, if you imagine India is right now growing at 7 or 8% per year, can you imagine in today's India, if auto sales, phone sales, stock markets, and real estate were all declining, It's inconceivable. Now, the economists who study this, who've done very careful, what's called instrumental variable models, estimated that Chinese GDP growth in 2017, 2018, 2019 was running at around 3 to 3.5%. But China is still in many ways a command economy. If you tell people produce 600 million tons of steel, and if you don't need it all, just dump it in a big heap, that still goes into GDP statistics. If you tell companies build thousands of apartments, but don't worry about fitting them out, no one's ever going to live in them, that still goes into GDP. That is, even wasteful production is GDP. And so I think what happened in 2017, 2018 is that China's growth may have been at 3%, but that extra increment of GDP was increasingly just wasted production, not actual useful production. Okay. What we've seen in China is that the coastal provinces have completely matured. This is GDP growth in China. The coastal province, actually, this is GDP in China. You can see the coastal provinces are around Beijing, the Yangtze River Delta, and the Pearl River Delta. The East Coast are the high GDP areas of China. Those areas have already started to reach South Korean levels of GDP. Not quite. I mean, Shanghai and Beijing are at South Korean levels of GDP. But those areas are the slowest growing parts of China. So Beijing, which is roughly on a par with South Korea, is not growing at all, right? The only growing areas of China are the very poor areas of Western China. In China, it may appear that this is Western China, but very few people live out here. The western belt of the Han regions of China is the only area that's still growing in China. And since coronavirus, it's not clear those have grown at all. I mean, these are based on official Chinese statistics. Take them with a grain of salt. China is continuing to report 5% growth, even with coronavirus. I think that's just not credible. All right. So this gives you an overview of what the global economy looks like, where it's likely to go. I'm personally very bullish on India. And in fact, having spent, I'm going to stop sharing, having spent about a year studying the Indian economy, I actually became much more interested in Indian democracy. And so instead of studying the Indian economy the last 3 years, I've actually been studying Indian democracy. And my next research project is actually not on the Indian economy. It's where I thought I was going to go. I thought, I'm studying Bangalore. I've written a couple papers on the app economy and how it applies to India, but I'm much more excited about India as a democratic model, and that's where I'm going to go next. Okay, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to stay as long as you want to talk and answer questions.
Thanks a lot, Professor Salvatore Babones, and for your illuminating lecture on this regional disaggregation of the progress of the economy, it's a trade, and how they are developing, and that's why geographical distribution, how it changed during the post-pandemic as well as the financial crisis after 2008 that started with the Morgan and company that is in USA, and that's why we say that if there is a undulation or any jerking in the Pacific Ocean, definitely Atlantic cannot be ideal. So though many of these new network companies is concentrated, as you said, that is basically based in the Pacific. So but it has been so much of globalized and used more in Asia countries, rather we can say, as in my opinion, because of the population. Majority of the world's people are living in the Asian these countries. So whatever be the trade, but that is going through the online mode, and very fast it is spreading. Anyway, so he has given an illuminating lecture where he started with that globalization. Then after that 2008 financial crisis, that views and how the banking system that was devastated and thereafter recovered anyway. And he gave a small highlight that the globalization that